You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Eric Johnson, and with me, as always, Zarak Khan.
Hello, everybody.
I love your enthusiastic hello is one of my favorite parts of these episodes. And we're excited to have a returning guest from a recent episode today. We have Steve Wendel from Morningstar. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again, guys. Happy to be here.
So, maybe let's refresh listeners' memory in case they, inexcusably missed our last conversation, but give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what you do and a little bit of your background, and then we'll dive into it.
Sure. So, Steve Wendel, I run the behavioral science team at Morningstar, which is a major investment research and software company. Before that, I was at a personal finance company called Hello Wallet, and I've been doing applied behavioral science for 12 years now. Good long time, and particularly looking at when people want to do something, why they struggle. And that's been my writing, that's been my job, that's been my the things I mutter about in my sleep. That's basically my life for the last decade or so.
And so we bring you here today because you have a new book coming out, which is an update of a previous book that is one of the kind of seminal books in the field, I say, at least as far as practicality and applying behavioral science. So your new edition of Designing for Behavior Change is coming out shortly. And I think by the time you release this, it will likely be available. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about our last episode was on more a kind of unique topic. We're going to kind of dive into more the nuts and bolts of behavioral science in this episode and talk about the book. And really, when did the first edition come out?
2013.
It feels like a lifetime ago.
Oh, and it sure does, man.
The field has changed quite a bit since then in the last 7 years or so. So we're going to talk about today is kind of, the new updates to the book, revisit some of those concepts, and talk about really how as a field we've changed since then and what's new. So let's just start diving into it. Maybe give us a little bit of a background for the original version of the book, what kind of brought on the impetus to write it in the first place, what was kind of the motivation, how did it come together, and just give us a little bit of the background for those of us who may not have read it the first time around or maybe just so new to behavioral science at this point that we aren't familiar with it yet.
So yeah, actually the impetus for the book and actually for Action Design really came from the same place, which is I didn't have a bloody clue what I was doing. And so I was working at this personal finance company, Hello Wallet, and we were trying to help people save for the future. And we told them, you should save for the future. And they more or less told us, duh, we know that. And we started to look at what do people really need? Obviously, they need more income. That's given. But given that, right, we find that people at all different income levels struggle to manage their budget, do their finances, et cetera. And I turned to the behavioral literature to understand what was going on. And so I started to both run experiments within Hello Wallet, started working with some of the prominent researchers in the field, and I was finishing up my PhD at the same time. And then I said, okay, well, this is good, but I want to better understand it. So I started writing out my notes, how I was thinking of doing. And that actually started in 2011. And by 2012, I'd hired a team that was doing this with me at Hello Wallet. And I wrote up a 60-page guide that said, okay, here's how we can apply this stuff. And this a description of what we'd done so far and kind of the framework that came from that. And my the head of marketing for Hello Wallet saw that and said, yeah, you should publish this. I said, really? All right, cool. So as it happened, had a friend of a friend knew O'Reilly and suggested that this might be a good fit for them. And thankfully they took it on. So I wanted to spend that time both to clarify what we were doing, as well as just learn what everyone else was doing in the field. And so the book was just a great opportunity to interview, to basically have an excuse to talk to all the people I wanted to talk to, which, by the way, is the exact same origin of the Action Design Network, which started at the same time, right? We started it to get the opportunity to hear from others in the field and learn from them.
Yeah, it was definitely the reason we started this podcast too. It was like, well, this is a great way for us to just chat with all the people that in some ways we were already having phone calls with, and we should just start recording these. So obviously, you made the comparison to action design, which has grown by leaps and bounds. The field itself has kind of grown by leaps and bounds. Like, what was the response to the book when it came out? And I mean, Eric kind of referred to it as sort of like a seminal book and kind of applied or practical application of behavioral science. What was did you like do a book tour or anything like that when it came out, or did you kind of use action design as a vehicle to talk about it, or were you already just kind of having these conversations anyways? Like, what was it like at first, and kind of maybe contrast that with sort of how it's grown and what it's like now?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't use action design to promote it. Rather, no, I used it to write it. So as I was thinking through these ideas and wanted to get people's feedback, I talked to DC and other meetups. But no, when it came out, honestly, I didn't promote it much at all. Did some talks and people heard about it and invited me. But O'Reilly is primarily digital. They don't do a lot of in-person stuff, and nevertheless, I mean, the book really took off, and I was quite glad for that. And so I spoke about it in the field, but I had a day job, right? So I did this as to help me understand clarify the framework, and hopefully to give back and help others in the field. But that was it, right? I wrote it, let it out there, did really well, and then I focused on my day job.
Yeah, and I mean, so I was kind of curious because I think I learned about it from you, or maybe I had seen it and I was like, "Are you the same person?" And it was like, kind of obviously, of course, this is the same person. We kind of had mentioned, or Eric noted this a minute ago, just like how it does sort of feel like a lifetime ago. I mean, 7 years doesn't sound like that long, but like it just feels like so much has changed in the field in the past 7 years, and maybe that's just a function of like me or us getting more active over the past several years. But I'm curious, like, what have you kind of observed over that time, and what prompted you to kind of do this updated version?
Sure. I mean, the field has changed immensely in terms of growing the number of people involved. In 2012, when I was writing, I had a difficult time finding companies who were actually using behavioral science. You find ones where we could sort of describe it as behavioral sciencey. That has completely changed now, right? The number of people, the diversity of people, diversity of companies, the diversity of countries has just exploded, especially over the last 5 years. And so actually O'Reilly reached out to me and said, "Hey, this book did well. We'd like to come back and do it a second edition." And honestly, first thing I said was no, right? I got a day job, etc. Then I started to look at the book and I was like, wow, man, so much has changed. Not like the core ideas I think are pretty good, right? And to be frank, we actually still use those. And the new book is really just an expression of how my team and those that have been learning from others in the field, how it's kind of evolved. But the core is still pretty much the same. But I looked at it as like, wow, we're not covering, this didn't really talk about, it didn't talk about the scope of the field because so much has changed. I talked a bit about ethics, but not enough. And I started to get into like, there are more things that I want to clarify in myself. And I do that through writing, right? So I was like, yeah, okay, all right, I'll do it. And so it's been the last 8 months of updating it. And it is, in many ways, it's a new book. It's not a minor change, right? I cut out many chapters, added a whole bunch.
Yeah, how does it feel like, I guess, compare the feelings of having finished the book and then finish the second edition? Does it feel like you've written a whole other book? Does it feel like you're kind of doing like variation on a theme? Like in terms of just like your, I don't know, kind of like your satisfaction. I mean, obviously I'm sure you're not the kind of person that puts out something that you're not happy with, but like, does it feel like, what's your sense of like kind of accomplishment with it?
Well, I mean, there's when the product's done feeling, which I don't know, because it hasn't come out yet. I'll feel a whole lot better when it's fully out, which it will be by the time this podcast is out. But when I actually look at the book itself, I honestly feel pretty good about it. It's much clearer. I've learned so much, and I've had the opportunity to learn from like hundreds of other practitioners in the field over the years, that I think it's just a lot more clear and a lot more practical. And some of that is the frank and helpful feedback that many people gave on the first edition. So I look back and I have to admit, by contrast, I actually feel not so great about the first edition anymore. I feel really excited, like the second one, okay, this one's clear, this one's great. But it served its purpose. It really was I looked around, I couldn't find any manual for my team and for myself. And that's why I wrote the first edition.
In a lot of ways, that's actually a good thing, because if, we're pretty relatively new field, at least in the applied sense, and again, like 7 years in a newly emerging field is a long time. In a lot of ways, if you were still perfectly happy with it 7 years later, that might not be a great sign for us as a field. I mean, that's a good thing that like so much has evolved and we've learned so much more and applied in so many different ways that
Yes.
we've grown in a way that it really made this a worthwhile endeavor to really make an update to it.
Yeah. And for me, it feels really good to be part of this bigger movement, right? I've contributed to it, and it feels good to see, wow, this has grown in so many ways, from Action Design Network to the hundreds of different companies organizing. I didn't cause that, but I was a small part of it, and I'm glad to be within that.
All of us in action design feel the same. So let's shift focus a little bit to the content of the book a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Sure.
We'll go into what's changed first. But first, maybe let's just do like a quick summary of sort of the basic concepts, because a lot of the stuff about the process and things is relatively unchanged from the original version. So maybe just like give a little bit of background for those unfamiliar, and maybe like what's like kind of the core concepts of designing for behavior change, and then we'll kind of start moving into what's really changed since the first version.
Sure. For those who aren't familiar, Designing for Behavior Change, the book, it's a manual for people to apply behavioral science in products and communications to help people change behavior in intentional ways that help your users. That's what the book's about. That's what the first edition is about, and that's what the second edition is about. The core ideas that you'll find in the second edition, and one of the things I really like about it is there's a much clearer, stronger structure, right? So it's first section of the book. What is applied behavioral science? What is this understanding of the mind that we have as people who are imperfect and limited and take a certain set of shortcuts? And those shortcuts affect our behavior, right? So that's section 1. Section 2 is, how do you do it? And that's this framework, Decide, which is walking through identifying what problem you're trying to solve, what behavioral obstacle people are facing, the specific interventions you can use, and then the testing of that in the field. And then the third section is, okay, how do you enter the field? How do you start a team? How do you deal with organizational politics and making this successful within a company? And so those are the core ideas. What is it? How to do it from a mechanical process stance, and then how you actually get involved in this field and be successful in it.
So, that's kind of the core structure of it. And again, people can check out the book and learn a lot more if they haven't already. But, let's talk about what are the biggest changes since the first version? What concepts did you or process did you kind of revisit and change versus what was like added or removed? Yeah. And how did that process go in finding those different things and making those changes?
Yeah, so I estimate I deleted at least 40% of the first book. I mean, just completely gone. And then it ended up actually being longer. The second edition is longer than the first one. I just couldn't stop. There's so much cool stuff.
So it's a pretty new book, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And then like another good 40% is completely reorganized, completely redone. This is in many ways a new book. And there's probably 20% that people will say, okay, yeah, this is the same text. So first and foremost, there's just a much easier and clearer framework for how to do this stuff, right? Across the field, we really do have a blueprint now. And I see this I've spoken to dozens of companies recently about what they're doing. And we're all pretty much doing the same thing. Now, we use different terms for it. I use the term Decide, right? Which focuses on determining what you want to do, evaluating the context, etc. But it's a problem-solving framework using behavioral science. And that's, I think, the most important thing. Is there's that framework on how to do it, and then there's concrete examples throughout, and a workbook, a free workbook that accompanies the book, which says, okay, here's how you do each and every step. Here's the sheet you fill out, and it's a description of what I do and what I've learned from other people in the field. So these are practical materials that we actually use. So that's, I think, the most important change. It's a whole lot more practical, and it expresses the blueprint that really the key practitioners in the field are now using, right? With my own terminology, but we all basically are doing the same thing.
So maybe let's start talking about some of the specific things that did change. I was reading before the episode with kind of the early copy you sent us, and just
Mhm.
going through a lot of those new sections. And there were definitely some areas that stood out to me. But maybe like before we even go into like concepts, we can talk a little bit about the survey of behavioral teams.
Oh yeah.
I think that was kind of I think that really influenced a lot of aspects of it. And you have a whole kind of section about what all those different teams are doing.
Yep.
And maybe that's a
Two
good
new
thing to like
chapters.
talk about relate to that, because I think that also in a way demonstrates a lot of why the new version was necessary in some ways, because those numbers are drastically different than they would have been if we ran a similar
Yeah.
in the first version.
Yeah. I looked for every darn one I could in 2012, and sometimes I could get beyond my hands to count them all, right?
Slightly different these days.
So yeah, two of the new chapters in the book, right, are specifically about what's going on in the field. So not just how you do it. So with the Action Design Network, thank you, and with the Behavioral Science Policy Association, we ran what appears to be the most comprehensive survey of behavioral teams, applied behavioral teams in the world. We both gathered all the existing lists of companies we could find to create a directory. We surveyed both them, and then just kind of went broadly across the field and across our contacts and the various lists out there. On our directory of behavioral science teams, which, by the way, you can find on the Action Design website, we count over 500, so about 530 unique organizations. And we surveyed we got detailed responses from just under half of those, which is really quite awesome. It's just wonderful folks participating and giving their details. And we asked quite a range of questions. So on, of course, how big is the team? What types of problems do they work on? What are the teams doing? Where are they? How large are they? What particular behavioral techniques are they using? How the team started? What challenges they're facing? And this, again, from about half of the known universe of behavioral teams out there. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And I've circulated the results to all the people who filled out the survey, right? As a thank you. And of course, you'll see them in the book as well.
Were there any, like, in looking at all those results, like any particular trends about the teams that were like surprising to you? Like there were definitely some things as I was digging through all the results that were I found interesting, but what was the most like interesting finding, or maybe most like surprising things that came from all of that input that we got back from it?
Sure. So, it's hard not to notice just the tremendous growth since 2013, right? Just nothing, or just few, boom, up. And it's not a clearly increasing trend. It's just very quickly raised to another level, right? And I think some of that is, of course, nudge, and particularly rational and books like that being popularized. And some of it's just the hard work of lots of individuals across the field starting these teams. So that's number one. Number two is just the tremendous geographic diversity that, well, to be frank, it used to be a Anglo-centric field, right? US, UK, leaders, Australia, etc. And now that just isn't the case. We don't even have the majority anymore, right? From the US, UK. Instead, it's the Netherlands has a big group, right? There's a nice cluster of activity in Cape Town, South Africa, in Peru, there are folks in Armenia. There's activity going on in Kosovo, just all over the world. It's really cool to see what folks are doing, and they're applying it in different ways, right? I've spoken to folks who work on human rights law and behavioral science, right? Who work on diversity and inclusion, like this group that has a book out called Inclusion Nudges, look specifically at how to help companies be more inclusive of a diverse workforce. In addition to the really standard stuff of helping people use your product, making clear what's going on, and engaging with them in an ethical way in your marketing, and finding the framing, the communication that resonates with people. So the diversity is wonderful to see.
How do you think that the diversity in like all of these different roles is going to, this is kind of like asking you to project out into the future a little bit, but like when I talk with folks that are getting into the field and they ask about roles in behavioral science, I almost kind of always make a distinction between like, well, you can have a role that's called like behavioral scientist or behavioral designer or something like that, or you could just be a product manager or policy analyst or whatever, but behavioral science, and that's maybe part of your job. Like, based on what you're kind of seeing in the surveys here, like, what's your sort of sense of, do you see that this is something that it's kind of permeating all of these different areas, and people are going to kind of develop like a behavioral kind of capability within those areas, or are they going to kind of just sort of meld like, behavioral science with kind of what they were already doing?
Sure. So I come from a very similar perspective, Zarak, and get those questions. Let me just put it in context. So taking the survey we did and the number of employees that people said were on these dedicated behavioral science teams, and to be clear, some of them are, let's just say they're being generous in terms of what's considered a behavioral science team versus a mix of other different disciplines. And the representation we got of the overall universe, the total official behavioral science employment that we see within companies and nonprofits is about 5,000 people around the world. Now, that diversity is, right, as I said, it's a very diverse group now, which is wonderful, but 5,000 that's less than the size of my company, right? Now, of course, we're not all behavioral scientists, but it gives you a sense of scale, right? It is far less than the number of people who got my book, right? The first edition of the book, second edition, etc. Or Nerial's, right? His did very well. His was on the order of about 300,000. And what we see in both the notes from the survey, right, as people responded on the growth of the teams and talking with all different companies, is that there are some official behavioral science jobs. And you should check out the Action Design website for the job board if you're interested in those.
Whoop.
But most of them aren't that. Instead, it's the application of behavioral science to existing jobs. And we see that in a few different hotbeds of activity. It's product development, right? In product managers, designers, interaction designers, etc., right? It is in marketing and communications, right? Those are the biggies. Then it's in HR, so the people analytics, kind of Google style. And we do some of that stuff as well. And then you see it also in there's a cluster within policy. There's a cluster within consulting. And in fact, a lot of the roles are in consulting organizations that are then working to help marketing, working to help product development, working to help policy. So when people ask me, how do you enter the field? I say, what field are you in right now? Are you in product? Are you in design? Are you in marketing? Are you in HR, etc.? Like, okay, you're in behavioral science. Go use this. Here are the materials. Here's how you get trained. Here's how you integrate this into your work, because that's where the growth is. That's where the excitement is. And I think teams like mine, many of them are going to go away because the field is growing. Because it just doesn't make sense. And this is actually a discussion I've had with Morningstar a number of times, right? Over time, we have product groups, right, within my team. We have a marketing group within my team, right? And, well, they're really just part of the product organization, part of the marketing organization, because we're doing product development and we're doing marketing. It's really, I think, only in academia and somewhat in the policy space do I think we're going to have a lot of official behavioral science jobs. The rest are going to be, how do you do product development better? How do you do design better? How do you do marketing better, et cetera?
So to what extent is that, or how does that show up in, when you're talking about like kind of getting into the field, and I don't want you to spoil all of the great stuff that's in the book, but
no, I'm happy to give all of the secrets here.
When you're talking about like kind of building out, or like the third section that you mentioned, like kind of getting started, to what extent is what you just said about like, these kind of specific roles and specific teams kind of going away in lieu of incorporating it into into these other functions, how does that show up in your recommendations or your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I shouldn't say going away. Rather, they'll be overshadowed.
Sure.
That there'll be a core of, we effectively have an internal think tank. We do research for publication within a private company. That's relatively rare. Right. But really it's overshadowed by the tremendous growth in design, product, et cetera, right? And so the advice I give is, first of all, you don't need a PhD, okay? A PhD it just shows that you can take the 6-year beat down, right? That's what it's about. It's a signaling, and it is useful, right? I won't discourage anybody, right? I did a PhD program myself, and it was tremendously valuable for me. But you don't need it to do this. Rather, you need, first and foremost, you need expertise in a field of application. It's not, okay, I want to learn behavioral science and then I'm just going to go to behavioral science, right? If you're going to be in a user-centric role, you got to understand your users. You got to understand the discipline you're in and how you can make that contribution. And behavioral science is a set of tools. And so I talk about some of those tools. I talk about the team structure, the type of roles that you need. But by and large, this is stuff you can learn on the job, and in particular that you don't ask permission for. You go do, and then you show, hey, I was able to do this awesome stuff because of behavioral science. And if you weren't able to do awesome stuff, well, it doesn't matter whether you're using behavioral science or not. Right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a distinction that almost, and I think you've kind of like made this point, it's sort of evolving, but it's worth repeating and kind of getting into our heads more. The behavioral science isn't necessarily a separate thing on top of everything else. Like, it's really a way of doing things that can be applied in any situation. And people ask me the same thing, and I give that advice too. I'm just like, you have a job that in some way, whatever you're doing, you are motivating behavior in some way, shape, or form. Start using behavioral science on it. There's no reason not to do it right now. Like, every job is behavioral in some kind of way. Thus, these tools that you talk about in the book are not applicable only to product managers, to people on behavioral teams. You can take that process and those tools and apply it to literally anything that you're trying to do.
Indeed. And I think of it as applied behavioral science is a process. As I said, we really do have a blueprint now, which the book describes, and again, is common with many other different groups. And that's a blueprint for how to do your job better. It's not a blueprint for a different job. It's a blueprint for how to do your job better, or perhaps the job you want to do. Now, behavioral science is a job for academics, right? But that is a different thing. That's not applied behavioral science. That's the research part of getting a more fundamental understanding of the mind, publishing academic papers, doing that type of study. And that is extraordinarily important. It's just different than applied behavioral science. I think of it as the difference between physics and engineering, right? The academe is doing physics, trying to better understand the fundamental way in which our minds work, the biases we have, and how we work around them. And I'm an engineer. I want to go help people take action. And that's generally not the focus of academic researchers, and that's fine. That's the focus of product people. That's the focus of communications people. That's the focus of HR folks, right? And that's where we can apply behavioral science to do our jobs better.
Yeah, so I think, a good transition is thinking about, so there's all these different ways we can do it and all these different roles, but we have to be thoughtful about how we do it. So one thing that was a pretty big addition to the book was kind of that whole ethics chapter. And this isn't to say that ethics weren't part of the first book. I think like ethics were very baked into the whole process of the book, because really the whole purpose of design for behavior change is helping people do things they want to do, right? So that's like naturally an ethical process. But I think in the new version, it seemed like you really drew out because of the ethics portion more. And I think there's got a reason for that, because with the explosion of people using this stuff, that naturally means there's more people doing it in maybe less ideal ways too. So maybe let's talk about the ethics question a little bit, and how you have your kind of general thoughts on the ethics of this process, how that's kind of evolved as the field has grown, and how we can continue to use that growth in positive ways as we all think about applying these kind of things.
Indeed, yeah. In the first edition, and I should say in many of the initial works in this field, we all kind of said, okay, well, don't screw people, and here's how you can do cool things, right? And the first was just a statement, and then we moved on to here's the exciting stuff. And what we've realized is that, well, there are a lot of really wonderful people out there doing good work. And there's also some good people who, well, we need to analyze a bit more closely what we're doing. And I say that for myself too. I say that for all of us. If you look at Nerial's book, Hooked, right? He thought about the dangers and he said, okay, don't do this. And what I've realized is we need more than that. We need more than just saying, hey, we should all be ethical. In fact, I think it's time that we start turning the tools of behavioral science on ourselves, because there's some real shady shit going on out there, right? And sadly, there are many, many examples, and I talk about some in the book. So Brignolle has a site called Dark Patterns, where he talks about and shames, right, in publicly displays. Here are all the bad things Amazon's doing, Google's doing, etc., right? The New York Times has been doing a wonderful series of stories on digital manipulation, right? They talked about Uber pushing people beyond the safe limits of driving, right? Where people would be penalized for taking a break, to eat, to go to the bathroom, etc., right? To sleep. And it would count against them if they just stopped. And we see that in a lot of the gig economy applications. They talk about ThreadUp, for example, and this is just one of many, right? Which used social proof and the fear of missing out, right? To say, hey, this person has bought it, and there are only this number of certain left. This person right here really loved it, etc. The problem was it was just complete crap. It was an algorithm generating names and generating fake sales to talk about to trying to get people to buy stuff. Like, that's wrong. But the problem is we know that already, and yet it still happens. And I don't think it's because we're bad people. And I do very intentionally say the we here, because I don't think it's bad apples over there, it's those people. We are pure and innocent. But rather, how do we learn about our own dishonesty? How do we learn about the ways that we trick ourselves into thinking these things are okay? I'm sure the people at ThreadUp, I'm sure the people at Uber, and I actually knew some folks at Uber who were on this, they're good people, right? The folks at Facebook, they were good people, right? But we get ourselves down a path where we rationalize it, we feel good about it, we feel it's okay to do in a given context. I think behavioral science can help us change that. Sorry, I know I've just given a long spiel here. So,
well, now I'm gonna prompt you to extend your spiel a little bit.
Sure.
How do you think that plays out as the role or the tools of behavioral science get sort of more decentralized and sort of like incorporated into other roles, where it's not just the ethics of behavioral science, but it's like the ethics of whatever job you are already doing, right? Like if you're already doing marketing and communications, like marketing and communications is not always like the most honest thing in the world anyways. Like using a fake person is like, that's, I would say, fairly common in marketing to sort of say like, here's an example of a person that used our thing. I mean, I know that the example that you gave is sort of a specific, they seem like sort of like on the same spectrum, So I'm curious, like where you think where you see the ethics kind of like playing out, where it's within the domain of behavioral science or what behavioral science can do versus within sort of just, broader, like within these roles that might be using behavioral science.
Sure. I think that as behavioral science and applied behavioral scientists like myself, we're confronting the same problems that have always been there in design, in marketing, in product, etc. What's different is we might have some unique tools to help, right? It's not that, hey, we're especially bad or especially good. Cialdini, right, for his early work, he studied the tricks that marketers used. He studied the tricks that salesmen used, and he actually became a car salesman in order to write about the persuasive and techniques that they were using, right? This stuff isn't new. What's new is a behavioral understanding of ethics. And in particular, I look to, Dan Ariely has a great summary of it in the Honest Truth of Dishonesty, which I think is, personally, I think it is his most important work and the one that seems to have gotten the least press, because he's talking about ethics and he's talking about how our environments shape our ability to lie to ourselves about how good we are, right? And so in that book and in a broader research that he both contributes to and draws from, we find that we can change our environment to be more ethical. We can change our environment to bring out our better angels, as it were, by having clear lines, by having independent review, by removing the fudge factor, removing the ability to, as much as possible, explain away our behavior and still feel good about ourselves. In other words, we can apply behavioral science to ourselves. And that is where I think it's exciting. It's not that we're confronting the same challenges that designers, that marketers, et cetera, have always faced. But we have a unique set of tools that might make it a little bit better.
So what other aspects of the book that are new are, worth noting and discussing? Man, there were a few other things. Like one thing I thought was interesting was the stopping negative actions was kind of a new thing, where we didn't focus on motivating behavior. Also, how do you stop behavior? So like maybe we can cover that a little bit. Like what else outside of that, what other things changed that are sort of like notable and, and what was the origin of some of those?
Yeah, sure. So yes, the stopping action became a key focus of this because I got a lot of questions about it, right? In the last few years of, okay, yeah, well, I want to help a person do this, but they're sitting on the couch watching Netflix, right? So they're not working on a blank slate, right? You're not, ding, this wonderful behavior we're working towards. No, you know, if somebody's doing something right now, how do you help them stop that and do something else? And so I dug a lot into that literature and found that there's a lot of similarity, right? It's often a different community of research, and they don't talk much to each other. But again, we've basically found a blueprint that we use across the different communities. And so I talk about that, both the theoretical side. How do you stop bad habits, right? There happens to be a great body of literature on how to do this. And it's the reverse of, in many ways, starting a habit. It is interfering with the cue. It's hijacking the reaction, etc. Then I think I have no idea what my other point was, to be honest. Yeah.
Too many to name.
Yeah. Oh, and then also I expanded not only on the theory side, but just as in the first edition, there was a big table that said, here are all the different techniques you can use, and then the subsequent chapters went through those. Now we're doing the same thing for stopping, right? So here's a table of, here's different things you can use. Yeah, so it's, I hope it's a useful addition for folks. I found it to be just fascinating to include and to work on myself.
Well, I think I have one question that is going to be on the top of everyone's mind, which is, why a coral reef as the image on the cover?
So I think the book is already going out. So if I tell O'Reilly's secrets, I don't think they'll be able to pull it now. So coral, as you may know, is not just a rock, right? Something that we see. It's actually a marine invertebrate. It's this tiny little creature that creates the coral reef. And what it's doing is coral designs its environment to make it easier to succeed at its goals. It creates the coral reef. It creates this architecture in which it can filter out the nutrients and it can live. And so it is an example of an animal, coral, designing for behavior change.
I love that answer. I also love that it's not just a yellow cover business book. I think it was Lean Holsworth. Somebody noted this. And I was
Yeah,
like,
we talked about that.
Yellow
They're
cover
all
books.
yellow.
I have like a stack of business books. They're all just yellow covers. So I'm glad to see some friendly coral designing its environment instead.
I hereby take a stand against yellow cover business books.
Does it be the change you want to see in the world?
Yes, that's right.
Awesome. So I think we covered a lot there. I mean, is there any kind of like last thoughts, or maybe, one thing that'd be interesting to think about is a lot's changed since the last book, and you've kind of evaluated the state of the field and the process in this. So, maybe what do you see, or what would be your kind of guesses or next steps, or even like hopes for the next steps between the second and the third version, should you choose to do it?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things I've thought a good bit about is both what's changed and also what's stayed the same, right? And so when you think about this physics and engineering analogy, the engineering side has grown immensely. And the diversity of the field, et cetera, and the way people are applying behavioral science in new and pretty cool ways. The physics side hasn't. We find that the techniques that people are using in the field are quite concentrated, right? They're the same techniques we talked about a decade ago, just as they were starting. We're talking about social proof. We're talking about choice architecture and framing. We're talking less about subtle primes, which I think is a good thing, but we're drawn from the same playbook, and that hasn't really changed. And what we find is that we have, in the academic community, we're seeing a move away from the one-off nudges, because they're pretty well done. We got those. And rather the question is, how do we create enduring change? There's an increased interest in habits, and I'm just heartened by Wendy Wood's book, Good Habits, Bad Habits. She's really the prime researcher and just a leader in the field. But how we help people in the long term change behavior, we don't know. And I give one of the examples in the book. I had the privilege of going to this, sitting on the wall, right, a fly on the wall, during this high power meeting of researchers, where they were all competing in this one problem to create long-term behavior change. And nobody succeeded. I mean, there were numerous Nobel laureates in the room, right? And I was a fly on the wall. I was very lucky to be there. And that's the big challenge, right? How do we get past, in a moment, in a decision, we can help change that decision, or in a moment we can help an action, to, I hope that the third edition will be about our understanding of human dynamics over the long term and how we can help people for years. And some of that is going to have to be a lot more theoretical work, a lot more physics, where honestly I feel struggling. And some of it will have to be new engineering and new long-term studies, long-term experiments in the field to do some good. So I think that's the main area that I look forward to. The other I look forward to is the more, and we've seen some of this already, but I look forward to the acceleration of it. The moving away from behavioral science, applied behavioral science, as a bag of tricks. I read Nudge. It talks about peer comparisons. We should do a peer comparison. That's going to solve all our problems. To understanding that behavioral science doesn't have a magic wand. We have a process. We do really have a blueprint now to help solve specific problems, and more focus on the dirt boring, right? On experiments and on iteration. It's not a sexy, cool magic wand. It's not a bag of tricks, but rather it's a process of learning. And if we're not testing, if we're not iterating in the field and getting rigorous measurements, then all the research I've seen and all the discussions I've had with folks says we're actually not having an influence and we just don't know it. So I really welcome that move from bag of tricks to a little more humility in our work.
Those are great points. I think we could talk about all those points probably for hours.
Yeah,
that'll be an episode, future of behavioral science, maybe. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. So help people find the book. How can they purchase the book? What type of things do you have going on to promote it? Anything that people should be paying attention to and joining in as it's coming up? And just more broadly, how do people keep in track of your work and yourself and learn more about what you're doing?
Sure, of course. So yes, the book will be out on Amazon in Kindle form at the end of May. It's available. Paper version is available in pre-order right now. The paper version is scheduled to come out second week of June right now. Okay, but again, you can pre-order that now. Now, by the time this comes out, the Kindle version should already be available for you. But you can also go to behavioraltechnology.co, where I will have the free workbook. It's like 20 pages or so of here's the exercises, here's the things you actually do. I will also have setting up a site where you can see some of the resources that are in the field. In the first version of the book, I had that in the book itself, and quickly realized, dang, this field's changing so much that got out of date. So this is the online version of that appendix. Resources where you can find Habit Weekly, Sam Seltzer's work, which is great, pointing to other folks in the field, and of course, action design resources. And then you can also, on behavioraltechnology.co, you can reach out to me. So I will be speaking in the field because of COVID and because of the pandemic. Obviously doing a lot more virtual events, right? We can't do in-person stuff right now. So I've already lined up lots of podcasts and webinars. But if you're interested, I'm happy to talk to your group. I love to talk with groups of people who are trying to solve problems and both learn about what you're facing and see if I might be able to help. So I've done lots of those for UX groups, for different product management, et cetera, groups before, and we'll be doing more of those now. So please check out the website, behavioraltechnology.co, and reach out via there if you have any questions or if there are any problems I can help you solve.
I was gonna say this has to be the longest you've gone without being on a plane, like in maybe.
Oh
ever.
Man, yeah, I have to admit it's nice to be with my family more.
Yeah. There are positives to every situation. So awesome. So I think that covers most of it. Any kind of final parting thoughts or any last questions, Rock, or last thoughts, Steve?
I'm happy. This was great. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Right? I mean, this is in many ways coming full circle for me. Right?
Yeah.
From
it's kind of crazy.
Initially learning about the field, getting excited myself, trying some things out, and working with action design to help grow my understanding. And now if I can give back, right, and kind of summarize this blueprint for applied behavioral science that we have, I'm happy to do so. So I encourage you all to check out the website, behavioraltechnology.co, where you'll find the workbook, you'll find information about the book, and you'll find me as well if I can be of help.
Awesome. Yeah, I think all three of us were kind of some of the original Action Design DC group back in the day. So,
Yes, indeed.
Reunion of those days. Yeah, and now none of us live there anymore, which is kind of wild. But
no, we've each gone to start chapters in other areas. So, and keep it going.
Moving on. So awesome. Well, thanks a ton for joining us. And yeah, make sure you check out the website, check out the book. It's awesome. The original book was an amazing resource, and the second one definitely is a needed improvement based on the advancements of the field. So everybody check it out. And yeah, thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendel, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.